Okay, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Um, okay, and you can see the pointer, right? Okay, so good. Uh, Hello, everyone. So, yeah, as Yanan was saying, I'm an assistant professor at McGill in the Department of Psychology, but my lab is sort of a mix of rodent neuroscience and sort of biologically inspired machine learning, and I'm also an affiliate member at Mila, the sort of Quebec AI Institute. And so one of the questions, sort of the approach we use in the lab is sort of think of computations and sort of cognition from both sides, from the artificial side and from the animal side, right? And so from the artificial side, right, we can build systems that can do perception, decision, action, and they do that pretty well in some constrained environments. But when we compare that to sort of the animal kingdom, it's very different. Animals can do these things sort of better, we think, or at least in a much more flexible way. And one of the sort of advantages of artificial systems is that we can design everything, right? We control the algorithm we put in, and so we have complete control of everything. While in animal systems is not the case. But one of the big advantages of animal systems and big differences is that there's a coupling between the hardware and the software that puts in constraint onto the type of algorithms that could be implemented. And so that's perhaps also what gives them their efficiency. And sort of trying to think both ways is sort of the approach we have as to how can we use ideas from artificial intelligence to sort of help us understand the brain and hopefully bring in some of the insights to design better sort of energy and data efficient algorithms as well as a sort of second step. And one approach we take is sort of thinking about what do we need to have an efficient artificial agent, right? So that's one of the sort of approach you can take, sort of break it down and what are the things you need. And one of the sort of key ideas in machine learning is this idea of reinforcement learning, that basically an agent takes in from the environment two things: observations about the state of the world and rewards. And the goal of the agent is sort of optimize reward according to some definition of reward by taking actions that is going to lead to more rewards. And then we can sort of open up the agent and see what in the agent sort of is processing the different types of information and sort of think about these systems in different ways. And here we're going to mostly think about how the agent values states of the world, right? What is the value of different states of the world? And so what is the sort of the value function? How can we learn the value of states in the environment? And so I think a lot of you must be familiar with reinforcement learning. And the idea is that you can do that by trial and error. Basically, you have value, you assign value to things in the world, and then you take an action based on that, and then you get a reward, another reward, and you update your value function as you go. And one of the key things in reinforcement learning is that value is sort of defined as the sort of sum of discounted future reward, right? So what is the value of a state is not just the reward you get in that state. It's actually the reward you can get from that state as well, but you discount the rewards in the future. So if something is happening further in the future, it brings value to a given state, but it brings less value if it's further out. So that's sort of the definition, the classic definition of value in reinforcement learning. And then basically, given that value, you choose actions in some ways with a policy, right, that will sort of maximize future value or sort of some normalized or regularized version of future value. And the key thing in this is that you learn all of this with a TD error, that's a local error, that basically compares the reward you get at a state, the discounted expected future value of the next state you would reach, and the current value. So you're comparing reward and discounted future value to the current value. And that's sort of the key learning signal. And so, yeah, so as I said, the sort of objective, the target is this reward and discounted future value. And this has been, very influential in machine learning, but it's also been extremely influential in neuroscience. So I presume some of you might know that there's this idea that TD error, this exact error from reinforcement learning algorithm, seems to be encoded in these dopamine neurons in the midbrain that project to the striatum, also to prefrontal cortex, but we'll think more about striatum, that project to striatum and modulate basically the corticostriatal synapses. So you have here a biological sort of substrate to have basically this TD error from our algorithm update a synapse in the brain, and the activity of these neurons really sort of matches very well with this reward prediction there. And so I don't know how familiar all of you are with sort of RL, but the key sort of, the first sort of key experiment that sort of highlighted this relationship was this paper by sort of Schultz, Stein, and Montague quite a few years ago now, that really showed that basically these dopamine neurons have this property of the TD error. And so how they did that? They basically recorded the neurons as the animals were learning a task. And so before learning, right, if you look at your TD error, before learning, you get a reward, there's no predictions. And so if there's no expectations, you expect prediction error at the time of the reward delivery. But once you've associated a cue with a reward, now what you have is that instead of having a response at the time of the reward, if the reward is completely predictable, then you don't get any surprise at the time of the reward, right? What you get at the time of the reward is just the reward and the expected value, that's exactly the reward. So there's no response. And instead what happened is that the response is moved to the first time that you can predict the reward, which is the time of the sort of conditioned stimulus, the cue that was predicting the reward. And so at that time, now you have a response because once that cue arrives, it predicts the future reward. And so there's value at that state because it's a state that predicts a future reward. And that value is sort of the discounted version of the actual value of that you receive at the time of the reward. And sort of the real sort of proof in a way that there was something like a prediction error was this test that in very few trials you can omit the reward. So you don't give the reward. And when that happens, you actually get a dip in the activity of the dopamine neurons. And that's because at the time of the reward, now the prediction is that you're going to get something. And so if you don't get it, you're only left with the negative term. And so you get this sort of negative response. And so this was sort of the first paper that really showed that in a very explicit way. But it's been sort of really shown very quantitatively across a number of experiments, across a number of labs, and across a number of species as well. But one thing that's important is that these neurons that really follow this reward prediction error are basically a subset of neurons from the ventral tegmental area that project primarily to the ventral striatum. And so it's this sort of subset of dopamine neurons that really follow this rule. But as people recorded from like a broader set of dopamine neurons in more tasks, they observe different things. And so you have things that look like more like salience prediction error, threat prediction error, like there's more variability. And so that puts a question as to whether, does the dopamine signal really is a prediction error, or if that's that sort of subset of the responses that are sort of doing something else that looks like a prediction error. And so one of the ideas we have is to think about how has RL progressed since these early days of the 90s, of RL in the 90s. And RL in the 90s was basically this idea of like, you have what's called a complete serial compound state representation, where you have states are like boxes, and you have state 1, state 2, state 3, state 4. You go through them in sort of a quite linear way in these tasks, where you have a queue and then you just pass time. And then the value representation is what's called a tabular value representation. You have a value assigned to each state, and it's really a table. Each state has its own value, right? And then with that, you do sort of reinforcement learning. But machine learning has sort of evolved from that. And so the first sort of parts of the first changes in the late 90s, early 2000s was this idea that instead of representing states in a tabular form, you're going to have a function approximation where you're going to have features of the states, and you're going to combine them with weights, a shallow network, not a deep network, to estimate the value at the different states. And similarly, the states don't have to be this sort of table where you transition from state 1 to state 2 to state 3. They might have some sort of dynamics. They might have belief state about the states. They might be like a sort of partially observable Markov process, so you have to estimate where you are. And so there's more complicated representations about the state space. And then finally, right, in the past like decade now, it's, reinforcement learning has changed. There's multiple value networks operating in parallel. They're all deep networks. The state estimation might be done by something very complicated, like an RNN. There might be several sort of reward prediction error signal instead of a single reward prediction error signal. And so that's a bit the idea in the lab is, can we think about these ideas in reinforcement learning to understand diversity in the dopamine system? And one thing to sort of point out is that reinforcement learning, unlike a lot of models in sort of computational neuroscience, and there was a recent debate about this idea of normative models are usually models that don't actually work in practice. Reinforcement learning models actually work in practice, right? They're heavily deployed in sort of tasks and agents across machine learning and practical machine learning. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind. That's actually an approach that works computationally. And so today we're going to go on an example of this idea of widening sort of the reinforcement learning framework to understand the diversity of dopamine neurons. And this was work that was done as part of my postdoc at Harvard in the lab of Nao Shida. And it was a collaboration with experimentalist Hyun-Woo Kim, who's now has his lab in Korea, and Arthur Malik, who's now has his lab and is sort of a physician scientist at Brown University. And this was a collaboration with Pablo Tano, who is a graduate student in the lab of Alex Bouget in Geneva. And specifically what we looked at is thinking that, can we sort of think about the timescales at which the system learns to see if that can explain some of the diversity in the dopamine system. So as I said earlier, typical value estimates in machine learning, in RL rather, are done using an exponential discounting, right? So the idea is that you have this factor at each time step that you discount by. And then when you combine that together, that means that stuff in the future get discounted exponentially. And so that means you have a single sort of, you have a single temporal horizon of exponential discounting looking into the future, right? And that's the time scale at which you devalue things. But you can ask yourself, why would you do that exponentially, right? Why would you do exponential discount in the first place? And so one way to think about it is that why do you discount is that stuff in the future has less value because there's a possibility that it doesn't happen, right? It's in the future, it's not certain. And so essentially you can think of discounting as the probability that your world model about something in the future is actually accurate. And so think about this mouse that's foraging between a cheese and a water. And so it can make plans about whether to go and get the cheese first, then the water, then the cheese. You can make these complicated, elaborate plans, right? About what is the value of the different states given different policies. But now if there's a predator that arrives, right? All of that is sort of gone, right? You have to hide, the mouse has to hide, otherwise it gets eaten and is dead. So basically the fact that the predator arrives sort of nullified everything. And so you can think a bit about the discount factor like this idea that the predator arrives, right? It's a bit of probability at each time step that everything in the future has zero value, right? And so you can think of the factor gamma as like a probability that you continue as normal, that the next time step is actually going to happen and it has the value you expect it to happen. And the probability 1 minus gamma, that's not going to happen and everything in the future is zero, right? And this is one example of uncertainty, but you can imagine that it can sort of encompass different types of uncertainty. So once we think about it like this, there's a sort of an issue that arises very quickly, is that why is there only one time scale at one thing can arrive at all times, right? And that's clearly not very precise. And so, for example, if you think about like, a lander landing on Mars, or you planning to make a decision, you have different sort of timescales that you have to plan at, right? There's sort of the immediate thing that's happening. There's a sort of intermediate thing, like what are you going to do at the end of the talk, where you're going to get up and leave the room. And then, what are you going to do at the end of the day when you go home, right? And so these are like different timescales of planning. Like, what are you going to do in the next month every day? And so intuitively, like the thing we're talking about, single timescale doesn't really work. So one way to do that is to have multiple timescales in parallel, right? You can think that there's a system that thinks about, hours, a system that thinks about minutes, a system that thinks about seconds. So that's a possibility, right? But it doesn't explain everything that we observe behaviorally. And then this other observation that some of you might have seen that is really puzzling and that really goes against this sort of exponential discounting idea. And that's this idea of preference reversal. So if we give this sort of simple example of a choice between $50 right now or $100 in the future, most of you are going to take the $50 right now, right? I mean, this is a virtual talk, so you don't see me, but like in practice, right? You're here, you get it, you should. In 6 months, you have no idea what's going to happen with the world. So like, you prefer the money now. But now, if you ask the same question to people and you sort of shift everything by 3 months into the future, so you ask $50 in 3 months now, or $100 in 9 months, you tend to see overall, on average, a preference reversal, where people now prefer the larger delayed reward. And one thing that's interesting is that this will never happen with an exponential discounting. So if you're discounting exponentially with a single time scale, you basically, for a given distance between the two sort of offers, wherever you ask the offer before, you will always have the same preference. You don't observe these sort of preference reversals on average. And so to explain this, behavioral economists and sort of and psychologists have introduced this idea of hyperbolic discounting. But the idea now is that instead of discounting with this exponential function, you discount with this other function. And this other function is essentially steeper at the beginning than the equivalent exponential and then shallower afterwards. And when you have this, you observe these sort of preference reversal, where depending on when you ask the question, you'll have different choices. And one of the problems is that this is not an exponential. So this does not, you cannot just plug that in an RL algorithm. The thing is not going to sort of converge to the right solution in a simple way, right? Because the exponential is sort of its own derivative, and that's how you also can derive sort of the convergence results in reinforcement learning. But there's something that people have realized recently, is that you can actually build a hyperbolic function from exponentials. So we had introduced this idea of these sort of 3 systems at different timescales. But now if I take the average of these 3 functions, what I get is this other thing that is not an exponential anymore, but it has a bit the same properties than our hyperbolic discounting we just talked about. We have a steeper discount and then a shallower discount later on, right? So steeper discount at the beginning, shallower discount at the end. And so that's a bit the idea, and that's what we looked for in this paper, is can we find evidence for this sort of multiple timescales that is exponential at the level of the single sort of sub-agents, but that together would be able to do something more complicated. And so one way to look at it is basically like that, is thinking about how can we combine these exponential functions to create something else. And so if we have our exponential discounting function, like we start with this one timescale, but now, if we think about having several exponentially discounting functions and basically combining them together in different ways, so we can do a weighted average, we can choose the weights for each of the different discounts. Together, that basically creates any function we want. And for those who are familiar with it, it's basically very similar to a Laplace transform in electrical engineering. And so basically, that's a bit the idea, is that if you have a distribution of discount factors, you can weigh them differently. And by weighing them differently, that will lead to a different discount function. And so if you have these different discount factors, it would give you the ability to basically discount the future in different ways. So what we're going to do here is really show that, indeed, the dopamine neurons compute the prediction errors with different discount factors. And so first, we're going to just briefly talk about some computational advantages of multi-timescale RL agents in general, and then we'll look at the evidence for dopamine neurons. So the key sort of idea is basically this, that if you have a single timescale, what happens is that you collapse essentially the expected future reward onto the discount, onto a single scalar. And what happens from that is that you cannot say whether a reward was basically small and soon or large and later, right? You're combining a lot of potential vectors that will give the same value at a given. So you lose this information. But once you go to the multi-timescale view, you're basically in this matrix form, where what you have is that you have a vector value estimate at different discounts for the same sort of expected future value into the future. And so now what happens is that if you basically can invert this matrix and pass it from the other way, you can recover basically the temporal space from the value space. And this is this idea of this Laplace transform. This is basically like a Laplace transform or a Z transform if you're in discrete space. But you can go from the value space to the temporal space because you have this sort of vector representation. And so that's sort of the key advantage that you have in multiple timescale systems. And so in the paper, and I'll let you go and read that in detail, we sort of highlight 4 key advantages that we have. And so one of them is this idea that I sort of mentioned, that you can decouple the reward size and the reward timing from the learning. You also have this thing that because of the multiple timescales, you actually have information about the reward timing and the state of sort of the reward times before the information converges, because basically some things scale together and some things scales with time. And so basically you're going to have this sort of temporal information irrespective of where you are within the training process, which is something you definitely don't have in single timescale systems. And then more generally, right, if you were able to leverage these multiple discounts, you can basically learn with an arbitrary discount. And also it would allow you to control the inductive bias of your algorithm because basically you control this hazard rate that we talked about, the probability of the predator arriving. And so if you're able to sort of match that to the, some statistics or some higher level information you have about an environment, it allows you to control the inductive bias. But I would let you go in the paper for more details about this. So now we're going to go a bit more into dopamine and how can we identify this sort of diversity of discount factor in the dopamine neurons. So here what we do is that we're going to measure basically this Q response that we talked about. And the Q response is going to be driven actually by the discounted future reward, right? So if you have here a discrete change in value, right, the Q sort of increases suddenly, the value increases suddenly at the time of the Q. And basically that increase in value here is sort of equivalent, right? It's at least proportional to the dopamine that you're going to have at that point, because at that point you sort of have nothing and the only thing you're going to have is this increase in value. And what's happening is that, the discount function tells you that once you've converged, basically that increase in value and therefore the dopamine response is going to be proportional to the reward size that you have at a given time, discounted by sort of how far that reward is. And so the idea is that by giving different rewards at different times, we can basically infer this discount factor. So we're going to do something very simple where we give rewards at different times. And basically by measuring the response at these different times, we're able to measure essentially how much a given neuron is discounting future rewards, right? And so how do we do that in practice? We have a task where there's a trial start queue that tells you that the trial is about to start. So that's sort of to remove some temporal uncertainty about queue timing. And then you have one of 4 other queues. And each queue is assigned to a given reward delay. So QA always predicts 0.6, QB always predicts 1.5, and so forth, right? And so now we can look basically at what is the response at the time of the queue, and that we can see if it differs across neurons. So the first thing we did in terms of behavior is to check that mice lick in anticipation to the reward. So they get the cue, and before the reward is delivered, they start licking in anticipation of the reward. And that's an indication that they know what's happening and that they're expecting a reward. And that's very important for the longer delays where there might be very little response, but we still see a behavioral response. So we know that the animal is sort of anticipating. And then we look at optogenetically tagged identified neurons that were recorded by Arthur and Hyung-Gu. And we specifically looked at this period of the odor cue. So the odor cue is when they first know how long they're going to have to wait for the reward. And so when we look at this cue response, we see this sort of graded response with stronger response for the shortest delay, weaker response for the longer delay. And so that's sort of the average picture, which we expect, right? The further out in the future the reward is, the more discounted it is, so the less value it has. So this is an average picture, but then when we look at individual neurons, what we see is that we see something that is very diverse across neurons. You have neurons that basically only respond to the shortest delay, right? And then you also have neurons that basically responds very strongly to the first 3 delay and only really drop in activity for the longest delay, right? And so now we have these sort of 4 times where we measure the cue response, and we can basically fit to these responses, right, an exponential function. And we can say that this exponential function is essentially the discount factor of those neurons, right? So we can see that a neuron that would respond very, discount very strongly has a small discount factor. So that means that each time step, it's multiplying by a small number, which leads to like sort of rapid discounting. And in comparison, a neuron that's over there would have a higher discount factor because there's sort of a shallower drop in the responses, right? Okay, so what we see here is that we have this sort of diversity across neurons now. And we can sort of look at it in different ways. So one way to look at it is basically to just plot the histogram. What is the distribution of discount factor across the population? And then the other way to look at it is to think about it as a discount function. So basically for each neuron, we compute the discount factor. And so now we can compute what is this exponential that corresponds to that neuron, which tells you sort of how far into the future that each neuron care about things, right? And so these neurons here with a low discount factor only care about stuff that's happening right now. And these neurons here with a higher discount factor care about stuff much more into the future, right? And so we can basically see a bit like what is the profile of temporal horizons across neurons. And then with that, we can basically also go towards this idea that we have this multi-timescale system that should have information about reward timing. So this discounting function matrix that I showed here, right, with how much the neurons care about stuff into the future, is basically this matrix that I was talking about earlier, right? Is basically exactly that. Okay, if a reward is happening now, it's the value of the reward, but then you discount anything in the future, and depending on the value, you're going to be discounting it differently. And so the idea is that you could go from value space to temporal space thanks to that discount function. And another way to look at it is through this, is basically what is the relative value as a function of delay in the value space. And so obviously the relative value of the shortest delay is like pretty much always the maximum value. But then we can see across the population, basically how does the value drop as a function of delay. And we can see that this shape it has, basically the shape across the population, is indicative of the reward timing. And so we have this in sort of the model and simple simulations, but we see that in the neural data. And so that means that we should be able to do this inversion with the neural data. And so that's what we did. We took basically the prediction error responses for a given delay. We have our discount matrix, and then we have the expected subjective reward timing, right? And the idea is that the prediction error is driven by this subjective expected timing that the animal has somewhere. And so to recover that, we're going to do a regularized pseudo-inverse of this discount function. And basically using that, we sort of pass it on the other side, and we can recover the expected reward timing, right? And so now if we do this, here you have the line here at 0.6 is sort of the true delay, and we can see that the recovered subjective reward timing is pretty good for this shortest delay, using the responses of the population to the shortest delay. And so now we can do that for the sort of second delay, where we take the responses to the second cue, right, that are not the same, And now we're going to decode what is the subjective reward timing for the second cue. And so when we do that, again, we get a pretty good estimate of the true reward timing from the population responses. And so now we can continue doing this. We can do that for the sort of third delay, and we get something pretty good again. And we can get it for the fourth delay, and we get something that's decent, and that's getting worse. But that's expected because it's a property of sort of the Z transform. When you have these sort of not infinite amount of estimators, right? We only have about 50 neurons. So we expect basically the precision to get worse as things are further out into the future. But we still get the right track. So here, what this implies is that we are basically able to decode reward time using this sort of inverse Laplace-like transform, and that the information is basically present in the population responses of the dopamine neurons. The timing information is there across the population, right? And that's something that just doesn't exist in a single timescale system. And so the final thing is that we wanted to check that this was not something peculiar about the matrix, right? And so if you break down the identity of the neurons versus the matrix, right, you shuffle the rows, you lose these predictions, right? So it's not just a property of the matrix. And so far, what we showed is basically this idea that we can establish this diversity of discount factors across the dopaminergic neurons. And then this structure would allow the different downstream areas to decode the reward timing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so is there any questions since this summary?
Sorry, I'm just going to change a couple things. There's okay, so okay, so this is sort of the first part, right? We establish this diversity, and we sort of show how it can be used. But there's something that is quite sort of peculiar here that we did, is that we measured the discounting using this very abrupt change in value, right? So it's a very sort of specific way of measuring value changes. Is suddenly the value goes from 0 to something, right? In practice, a lot of cases in real life is much more continuous, right? You approach a goal rather than just like suddenly the thing appears, right? And so how does dopamine behave when you approach a goal? So there's been debates because you see these ramps in the dopamine signal, and there were debates in the literature about whether those ramps were signature of a prediction error or a signature of a value computation. And there was a pretty conclusive paper by Arthur and Hyung-woo, who showed really that those ramps could be understood as a reward prediction error signal, and they used teleport in virtual reality. I really encourage you to read this paper. But this is basically the setup we used for this next experiment. And so here, what's happening is that it's very simple. The mice experience this linear track, just see this. And at the end, they get a reward. That's it. And when you do that, on average, across dopamine neurons, you see this beautiful ramp in activity, and then you can look at it in calcium signal, in the cell bodies, or in the axons and striatum. You see this beautiful ramp in sort of the dopamine activity. But this is an average thing. And now if you look at single neurons, you actually see, again, a very strong diversity. So you see these neurons that ramp up, neurons that ramp down, and neurons that do something in the middle, right? So you have this extreme diversity across neurons. And so the question is, what does this diversity sort of come from? And so one way to think about it is go back to, again, why do you see ramps in these tasks? And so here the idea is that you're going to have a value function that's common because of the sensory expectations that are coming in about how far the reward is and how uncertain about the timing you are about the reward. And so you get this one value function that's sort of built by the agent. And now you look at the increase in value between two time steps, right? And now we're going to say that the increase in value between s and s plus 1 is 1 over gamma 2. And so now if you discount with discount factor gamma, what's going to happen is that you're going to have exactly, an increase in the value by how much you discount by. And so basically you have no prediction error all along, right? If your discount factor is bigger than gamma 2, then you're going to have a positive prediction error because you're going to discount less than how much the value is increasing by. And so you're going to have this sort of positive ramp. And now if your discount factor gamma 1 is smaller than gamma 2, you're going to have a negative ramp because you're discounting more. Even though the value is increasing, the discount is bigger. And so basically, you're going to have this sort of drop in the discount function, in the prediction error. And so that's sort of how we can explain this diversity, is that by having different form of the value function, this is going to lead to basically different prediction error across the population as a function of the discount factor. And if specifically the discount function is not exponential, but has some sort of off-exponential shape, for example, cubic, you're going to have something that looks like this, that looks a lot like what you see in the behavior. And so this is what we did in the analysis. We basically took all our neurons that we had recorded in the task, and we fit them to a common value function, but then each neuron has its own discount factor, right? And so this is what we observe, is that we get this sort of best fit value function that looks a bit like that cubic value function. So it's non-parametric, like each spot is fitted independently, but it has that thing that it's not really exactly exponential. And you can see here sort of it rises steeply, but then it would rise sort of even more here if it was exponential. It sort of tapers a bit around there. And then we get, again, a diversity of discount factors across the population, right? So we can explain basically this, and now we can see sort of what the model fits look like. We can explain this diversity of ramping as essentially a diversity of discount factors when looking at an increasing value function that is, convex, strongly convex, but like not exactly exponential. And so depending on your relative discounting versus the value, you're going to basically see. Okay, so here we explain in a completely different way, right? Another observation, this diversity of ramp through the discount factor, right? So now we have these two different stories, I want to say. One of them is that you have discrete changes in value and you can measure the discount factor. The other one is you have continuous change in value and you can measure the discount factor, right? And the beauty of this experiment is that some of the animals were actually recorded across both tasks. So we have recorded the same neuron in the discrete change in value task and in the continuous change in value task. And so now we can look at what is the correlation across that population of the discount factor across the two tasks. And so what we see is that there's indeed a pretty strong correlation across discount factors. So what does that mean is that if you have a high discount factor in the VR task, you tend to be a ramp up neuron. You also tend to be a acute delay neuron that has a shallow discount, right? And similarly, if you have a steep discount in the acute delay task, you tend to be a ramp down neuron. So the discount factor could be like a tuning property, basically, of the neuron. It's really like a tuning of the neuron, just like you could think about sort of, angle of tuning in a V1, simple cell, something like that. And so that puts strong constraint as to how you would implement this algorithm in the brain, because now each neuron would sort of always be a high or always be a low discount factor. And so it makes it much easier for the striatum to read out sort of what's coming. So to conclude, basically what we found is that we have these sort of, distinct computational advantages of having multi-timescale RL agents, and specifically this idea that now we have this matrix form of the value representation, and we can go from value space to temporal space and back and forth. And then we really established that you have this diversity of discount factors across dopamine neurons. And so this diversity allows you to sort of decode the reward timing. It allows you to explain this sort of very diverse ramping behavior. And importantly, at the end, there's this strong evidence that the discount factor is a neuron-specific property. And that means that it is basically always high, given neuron is always high or always low discount, which sort of constrains a lot how you would implement these sort of algorithms. And so just to conclude and sort of think about what it means is that here what we showed, right, is that if you think about this this prediction error equation, we showed that across dopamine neurons, you have a diversity of discount factors, right? And so these discount factors allow you to learn across multiple temporal horizons. So what you have is that you have different, basically, discounting functions, like different horizons about which you care about value across neurons. And there's been sort of parallel work that has shown that by changing the learning rate or the sort of subjective function, so really this is like, given an absolute reward in the environment, how much does this neuron, or how much, what is the utility of that reward for the neuron? So how much changing the reward affects a neuron, right? And so what's been shown is that by having a diversity of these tuning across neurons, so it's really how much do how much does this neuron care basically about a given reward size? By having different, essentially, tuning functions across neurons, you're able to implement something called distributional reinforcement learning, where now, instead of learning just the mean value, you can learn different properties of the distribution of rewards. And so now you have this idea of learning a full distribution of reward sizes or reward probabilities rather than just a simple mean. And so that's sort of a second dimension that's orthogonal of diversity, of going, different discount factors is different time scales. And now you have this idea also of distributional RL, where you have different sort of expectation of the reward size. And so these are two dimensions in which there seems to be a lot of variability across neurons. And so that's one of the sort of questions, for example, in the lab we're thinking of, is how can we think about some of the variability we observe in dopamine neuron as variability across these two dimensions. And sort of one of the questions is how do they work together, and how do you combine both multi-timescales and distributional RL together in sort of both artificial systems, but I want to say more importantly in the brain. And with that, I'd like to open the floor to questions and thank the lab here at McGill. So Yanan is a grad student in the lab, co-supervised with Robert Zatorre. Zijing is also working on this idea of sort of distributed reinforcement learning. And Manoush is doing the same on the more, I want to say, machine learning side, working with Dominic Prica. And then Chen and Adele are rotation students on the sort of computational neuroscience to neuroscience side of the lab. And yeah, I'll take any questions.
Okay, so there are two questions in the chat. I can just read aloud. Can these models be generalized or transferred to human MEG data?
MEG data. Yeah, so I haven't, I've never done MEG myself. One thing is that, the dopamine neurons are in the midbrain, which is like as deep in the brain as it can get. So I think with MEG, it's going to be difficult to see that, right? So it's going to be difficult to see this idea of the dopamine neurons having multiple timescales. But what is sort of thought is that some of those value representations are also, for example, prefrontal cortex, right? And so perhaps you'd be able to see some of that in sort of prefrontal representations, for example. And, you have representations of different things at multiple timescales. So here we're thinking about dopamine neurons, TD error, but motor control happens at multiple timescales, right? All of these things happen at multiple timescales. So you might be able to see some evidence for these sort of things. But the other thing to think about is that here we're looking at single neurons, right? And in a way, you have to think about how does it look from the point of view of single neurons to the point of view of the population, right? And as soon as you're going to have a population signal, it might look more like that aggregate thing, so this hyperbolic-like discounting. But you would expect that hyperbolic-like discounting, for example, to be context dependent. So if you need longer timescales in motor control, you'd expect that to be present in the signal potentially versus a task where you need short timescale. But it would be at the aggregate level. And so I think that's always something to be careful about, is thinking from the aggregate level to the single neuron. And if the single neurons are not aligned along any sort of anatomical direction, it's like salt and pepper all mixed up, then it's hard to know how it's going to look.
Thank you. And there are 3 other questions, but you can also just open your mic and speak up. But I'm just gonna read the second one. Is it possible to train the mice to change the distribution of these discounting factors, or if we can damage or mute certain neurons with higher values of discounting factor, for example, what might happen? And can we use it to explain and intervene certain behaviors like addiction?
Yeah, no, so that's a very good question. So, that's sort of some of the things we're going to do in the lab. We're going to do rats primarily because it's easier to train them on more complicated tasks. And so I think that goes back to this idea that here it was a Pavlovian task where animals experience the rewards, but you have to do a task, and people have done these tasks where you have to choose between rewards at different delays. And that's where, by changing the priors about distributions or changing some stuff, you can induce different expected distributions. I would also like to point out to another very related paper from the lab of Joe Padden at Champalimau by Margarita Souza as the first author, who does something very similar to this in the first task. And then they don't have the ramping thing, but what they do is that they do a bit something like this, where instead of giving 4 delays, they give 4 delays, and then they remove either the shorter one or the longer one. And they see that there's a bit of a switch in the behavior that's consistent with basically an adaptation to the expectations of the reward times. And then finally, the damage or mute certain neurons, that would be amazing. But what controls the discount factor in a neuron, we don't know. And that's from what we have, there's no real anatomical mapping. They all seem to be interleaved in the same areas. So doing, that might be something we're thinking about, but it's not easy. There's no anatomical gradient you can work with, it seems.
Okay, thank you. Next one is hello, Professor. One for research and presentation. Can you share how you came up with the idea for this research, and in the process of practice, what is the most difficult to encounter? How did you overcome it?
Yeah. So I think, so how does this come about? We're thinking a lot about this idea of distributional reinforcement learning in the lab, right? And there's sort of a paper from DeepMind that used data from Nao's lab to show that there's very strong evidence of distributional RL in dopamine neurons. And as part of reading this, right, we were also thinking a bit about timescales, and we read some papers, and I can point specifically at this paper from William Fittis, that sort of looked a bit at the parallel of the distributional RL with the multiple timescale learning, right? And so that's a bit, I was like, okay, there's also this possibility of diversity of discount. How can we test that, right? How can we check, and how can we test that? And then it's a bit, I think the process is, you have this theoretical idea, is like, what is the task that allow you to measure this thing in a very precise way, right? This precise mechanism. How can you measure the tuning of a neuron? And in a way, that's what we do here, is like, what's the right task to measure tuning of a neuron? And then we had the experimental setup from Hongyu and Atta that allowed us to do other things as well.
Okay, thank you. Since you just mentioned this distributional RL, so I also got a question because I read that paper several years ago before I came to know your research. I just wondering, like, do you have an idea of a potential model that the downstream application of these different kinds of signals from dopamine, like how do distributional RL in terms of learning rate and distributional RL in terms of multi-timescale, these signals will be like integrated.
Yeah, so the question is a bit about how do we sort of think about the integration of the signals? So the distributional side, we haven't tested that yet in the sense that the idea that it would be a tuning of a cell-specific property, right? And so this idea that we have in the paper that perhaps the discount factor is like a property, is really a tuning property of the neuron. If you have the same thing across, distributional, it makes it much easier for the network to be able to deal with that later on, because even though you might not have an anatomical gradient, you'll have local anatomical information that you have one or the other. So that's the hope, is that these things are sort of cell-specific properties. You can deal with it in a complicated way because it's overlapping signals that are going to be multiplexed, but you could deal with them. Like, it's doable.
Thank you. And next question. Can the diversity of discounting factor be further characterized to several types or totally individual properties in neurons?
Well, so here it's just a discount factor. So I think afterwards there might be something whether the discount factor changes with scale or not. So, there could be other changes to the value of the, to what the discount factor is exactly. But I think one thing to say is that what we think might be happening more is that the discount factor might be like a rank order rather than an absolute value. So it's not like your discount factor is always, I'm discounting at like 0.5 every second. It's more like I'm in the middle of this range. And for example, if you change the distribution as to how you use it, you could have this sort of timing signal come in from somewhere else, but then the high discount is always the sort of high discount in that distribution, but that absolute value might be changing. So that's sort of what we think might be happening.
There are a lot of questions. So how we think of the advantage of quantile-based coding in distributional reinforcement learning versus other forms of coding like population coding, sampling-based coding in V1?
Yeah. So like sampling-based coding, I also work a bit on sort of sampling and probabilistic representations on that end. It's quite different. The idea there is a bit more that you're estimating different parts of the signal, but you could think about a sampling code, for example, as like exploring the thing. And then from that sampling, you could extract also sort of the quantiles of the distribution, right? So it's a bit like it's more like you're looking at summary statistics in a way, rather than like exploring the entire space.
Okay, and next one is great talk, really insightful. In human studies, there are many other models for intertemporal decision making, such as hyperbolic-like models with an additional parameter, etc. Have you compared these models in the data to see which one fits the best?
Yeah, so we compared, it's in the paper, I didn't show it. But so for example, when we do the fit from single neurons, we compare it to, we compare that to a hyperbolic model. So we fit single neurons to a hyperbolic model. And we, in general, get I mean, at the population level, it's nearly all the neurons. We get a better fit from the exponential model. So it seems that individual neurons are more exponential than they're hyperbolic. But I think at some point, it's, it's more this idea of the diversity that's really important, of having different timescales across neurons that allow you to create any discount function you want. And so the Laplace code, if you think about it, has this this exponential idea of multiple exponentials. But what's really important is that you have these basis functions at different sort of timescales that allow you to create anything. And so, yeah, so here we only have the neural data, and at the behavioral level, the discount is a bit different, but we don't have a real behavior. The only thing we have is the anticipatory lick rate. So it looks a bit different on the anticipatory lick rate side.
Okay, thank you. Next one is from Hamburg. Would you be able to just open your mic? I'm not gonna read your question.
Oh, hi, Paul. Oh, sorry. So I have a question for your talk. Are the neurons inherently computing different discounting skills, or they are trained to do so? So this is kind of remind me of the training of neural networks. So we can actually random initialize a neural network, but when training a task which requires discriminative representation, so finally we're able to find different representation in the hidden neurons, right? But that does not mean different neurons may actually have a different role before the training because they are random initialized. So I was wondering in the brain, does the same principle apply for the rodents, or they're actually having different neurons discriminative to different discounted skills?
So, we only record after the animals are trained, so we don't know how these things emerge. The fact that it's shared, that the discount is the same across both tasks suggests that the discount factor might be something that is, a bit inherent to the neuron. Afterwards, remember, this is RL, so what you're only looking at here is the error signal, right? So what would happen in learning a new task is that the value representations are sort of not correct at the beginning, but that doesn't mean that each neuron would not be computing the error based on those wrong values with a different discount factor, right? So it could be that you see what I mean? The discount factor could be really an inherent thing. And then it's just that to see what we observe, it only appears after you've learned the correct values, but the learning signal might have a different time scale even at the early stages. But that's something that's happening more and more as it becomes easier to record from neurons. We're starting to have data in training and things like that. So some people are recording, some labs are starting to record from animals during the training phase, which is going to be very important.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark.
Okay, one last question. Asking for a friend, is your lab currently recruiting PhD students? And would experience with IL modeling and rodent experiments to be required?
Yeah. So this cycle, the application cycle is passed for the fall here in Canada, but I'll probably be recruiting for next year, and probably building up more on the sort of rodent side of the lab, electrophysiology and rodent doing these tasks and testing things. So if you know anybody who's interested in that, I'd be very happy to.
Okay, thank you. How are you?
Hi, Paul. Great. So I was just curious. You mentioned like in VTA, the dopamine representation is very rich, and on the other hand, you will be transported to other regions like striatum. I'm just curious, what do you think? How much information striatum has? Like, it has a population level information, or it also maintains the very rich, like individual level representation.
So the striatum representation is very diverse, right? It's very diverse. There's a lot of neurons in striatum. So it's a good question. There's a recent paper from the Shida lab in Nature that just came out that showed that on the thing about distributional, not the multi-timescale, but the distributional RL side, that you do have these sort of distributional-like representation in striatum. So it does seem that indeed the distributional information is present in striatum, basically. So if you have the distributional information, you probably have the multi-timescale information. So yeah, so it's probably kept there. Exactly how it's done, it's unclear, but it's really seems to be there.
Thank you so much.
Also, why you got a question?
Yeah, sorry, Paul, I've got a final question.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for your impressive work to show us those heterogeneous neural firing patterns. I'm just out of curiosity. So how would you predict those neural firing patterns in extinction learning? Because what you show us is a Pavlovian acquisition.
Yeah. Well, so you could do the same thing, right? You just compute the prediction error and how it looked like in extinction learning. And that would, I want to say, give you the predictions that you see, right? Like, you see what I mean? Like, once you have characterized the parameters of your neuron, what is the learning rate? What is the discount factor? You could see how it looks like. I would put that in extinction learning, you really need to have a good model of what is the state. And again, I will refer you to a paper from Nao's lab that just came out in Nature Neuroscience like yesterday or the day before yesterday. That's more about contingency degradation. That's a bit related to extinction learning. And it really highlights how important it is to think about what is the state of the task. Like, you sort of going beyond the CSC representation is very important. And so I think in extinction learning, that might be the more important part. Right. I mean, the discount factors are going to matter, but a lot of it is going to be more driven by the state representation. Like, what is the animal thinking is happening? Is it thinking it's in a different state? Is it thinking that state has less value? Right. Like, the structure of what's happening, it might be more important in driving that.
Okay, I see. I'll definitely take a look at the paper you mentioned. Thank you for your answer.
Thank you. So is there any other questions from the audience? If not, so perfect timing. Thank you so much, Paul, for coming, especially it's very early in the morning. Yeah, thank you for your great talk. And thank you for all the questions.
Thank you for the questions. Yeah, thank you for the questions.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah.
Okay. Welcome to our next activity in the future. Yeah, thank you, everyone.